Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. Today we're diving into a concept that's it's really at the heart of a lot of philosophy and especially epistemology.
Mhm.
We're talking about a priori justification and knowledge.
Yes.
So when we talk about a priori justification, and I think you know this as a philosopher listening, this is about justification that in a key sense doesn't depend on experience.
Right.
We'll be contrasting it, of course, with a posteriori justification, the empirical kind, which does, of course, require observation,
Right.
through our senses or even introspection.
Hmm.
And this initial distinction, I think we'll see, opens up a wealth of really fascinating territory.
Absolutely. And, for you, our listener, immersed in these kinds of questions of, how do we come to know things? How do we justify our beliefs?
Right.
This deep dive on a priori justification and knowledge offers a really focused exploration
Yeah,
of some of the core arguments and ongoing debates.
absolutely. Yeah.
We really want to go beyond just defining terms here.
Yeah,
We want to get into the nuances that really matter in the philosophical discourse around this.
absolutely. And so the mission for us today is to really dissect the nature of a priori justification. What sorts of propositions are claimed to be knowable this way?
Right.
Are we primarily in the realm of necessity and possibility? What we sometimes call modal propositions?
Hmm.
And what are the really central arguments concerning the validity and the significance of a priori justification itself?
Yeah.
So we're approaching this with a keen awareness of the philosophical landscape you navigate.
Exactly. And to provide a clear path, I think, through all this, we're going to start with some illustrative examples just to solidify that distinction
Yeah.
between a priori and a posteriori.
Okay.
We're then going to examine the scope of a priori knowledge.
Okay.
Is its reach limited to modal claims?
Okay.
And then we're going to address the really crucial questions of fallibility and defeasibility.
Right.
Can a priori justifications be wrong? Can they be overridden?
Yeah.
And then finally, we're going to explore various philosophical accounts of the nature of a priori justification, with special attention, I think, to the role and the challenges surrounding the concept of intuition.
Okay.
So let's begin by just really unpacking that core distinction
Right,
with some examples.
Yeah.
And I think this will resonate for you.
Okay, so the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy actually provides a really nice set of contrasting propositions that help kind of illustrate this foundational difference. So let's take a pair. All bachelors are unmarried males
Right,
versus all bachelors in the U.S. are taxed at a different rate than married men.
right.
Now, for you, engaging with philosophical definitions all the time, the first one just seems immediately knowable, right?
Yes,
By simply understanding the terms bachelor and unmarried male.
exactly.
I mean, it's true by definition. I think they would call this analytically true.
Yeah. Yes, precisely. The justification for believing that all bachelors are unmarried males arises simply from the meaning of the proposition itself.
Yeah.
It's self-contained, and that's really the essence of the a priori,
Yeah,
right?
okay.
You don't need to go out and do any kind of survey of bachelors
Exactly.
to see if this is, in fact, the case.
But the second proposition about taxation clearly demands some kind of empirical investigation.
Yeah.
You've got to look into tax codes and actual practices. And so
Mhm.
that's really rooted in experience.
Mm-hmm.
It's a posteriori.
Yes.
Let's take another pair. All vixens are female,
Right.
compared to all vixens are cunning.
Mm-hmm.
Again, vixen inherently just means a female fox.
Yes.
So the first one is a matter of conceptual understanding.
It's conceptually necessary, right?
Yeah.
Built into the concept.
But the second one, whether vixens are in fact cunning,
Right.
requires observation of foxes, or maybe analysis of folklore.
Or
Yeah.
something, yeah. You have to go out and see it's not part of the definition.
Exactly. And that's the empirical domain. One more from this initial set. Green is a color
Okay.
versus grass is green.
Right.
It just seems intrinsic to the concept of green, that it falls under this broader category of color.
Exactly. Understanding green involves understanding it as a type of color,
Yeah.
but knowing that grass specifically exhibits this property requires that you go out and have a look.
You've got to have sensory experience.
You have to experience the world.
Yeah.
So I think you can see the pattern here.
Totally.
The a priori examples, the justification seems to come from
Yeah.
our understanding of the propositions themselves,
Yeah.
whereas the posteriori ones necessitate engagement with the world
Yeah.
beyond that understanding.
Totally.
And, one thing that the encyclopedia points out that's important is that, a proposition could be false
Yeah.
and yet still be justifiably believed a priori
Right.
or a posteriori
Yeah.
before we discover its falsity.
Right. That's a critical point for any epistemologist to keep in mind. Justificatory status doesn't guarantee truth.
That's right.
Okay, so having established, I think, this core distinction between a priori and a posteriori, let's move on to the scope of a priori knowledge.
Okay.
Is it, as some might think, primarily or even exclusively limited to these modal propositions,
Yeah.
these claims about necessity and possibility?
Yeah, this is a really central point of contention, I think, in contemporary epistemology.
Okay.
While it's pretty widely accepted that we can have a priori knowledge
Yeah.
of, some necessary truths,
Right.
like, those in mathematics and logic,
Yeah.
the waters get a little bit murkier when we consider
Yeah.
seemingly necessary truths that are discovered through empirical means.
Okay.
So, take, for example, water is H2O or rubies or aluminum oxide.
Right.
Now, a lot of people would hold that these are necessary truths. They reflect, the fundamental constitution of these things.
Yeah.
Yet, the discovery of this fact
Yeah.
was undeniably a posteriori. Right.
Yeah.
It relied on scientific investigation.
Right. We had to go out and figure that out in the world.
That's right.
So the argument is that our knowledge of these underlying essences, of these what they call, natural kinds,
Right.
is empirical,
Mm-hmm.
even if those essences are themselves necessarily what they are.
That's exactly right. So the meaning of water, for instance,
Yeah.
might initially be fixed by some kind of descriptive term.
Right.
Right? Like the clear, drinkable liquid found in lakes and rivers in the actual world.
Right. Right.
That description we can grasp a priori.
Okay.
But the discovery that the substance fitting that description is H2O
Right.
is a contingent empirical finding about the actual world.
Right. Okay.
We had to go out and investigate that.
Interesting.
Right. Now, contrast that with a proposition like all rubies are red.
Okay.
Right. Now, for a gemologist, the redness might be considered part of the very concept of a ruby.
Right. So
Okay.
that would make it a
That's
conceptually necessary truth.
That's conceptually necessary truth.
Yeah.
And thus knowable a priori,
Right. Right.
at least for someone with that
Yeah,
specialized understanding.
Right.
And, the encyclopedia actually highlights this sort of hybrid nature here.
Yeah.
Color, arguably a priori for the expert.
Right.
Chemical structure, definitively a posteriori.
Right. This highlights, I think, the complexity of trying to draw really sharp lines
Yes.
in epistemology.
Correct.
So if some necessary truths then fall into the a posteriori domain, what about the converse?
Yeah.
Can we have contingent truths, those that happen to be true,
Yeah.
but could have been otherwise, that we can know a priori?
Yeah, this is where things get really interesting. And the encyclopedia provides a number of really compelling examples that philosophers have wrestled with.
Okay.
So one is Saul Kripke's
Right.
famous standard meter stick example.
Right.
So imagine a specific stick, we'll call it S, in Paris.
Okay.
And we stipulate that 1 meter
Mm-hmm.
is defined as the length of S at a particular time, T naught,
Right. Okay.
in the actual world.
In the actual world. Right.
So the proposition S is 1 meter long at T naught
Yeah.
is clearly contingent.
Right.
I mean, that stick could have had a different length
Right.
in another possible world.
Right.
However, we can be said to know a priori
Okay.
that statement is true in the actual world,
Okay.
simply by virtue of our definition.
Okay.
So the empirical engagement here is really limited to,
Yeah.
acknowledging that there's a stick S and the act of designation.
Right. The reference is anchored in the
Yes.
actual world.
Yes.
But the truth pertains to that very act of anchoring.
That's right.
It's very subtle.
It is.
What other examples do philosophers consider
Yeah.
of these contingent a priori propositions?
Yeah, so John Turry gives a particularly ingenious example.
Okay.
He says, the most unlikely possible event is not presently occurring.
Okay.
So by definition, the most unlikely possible event
Right.
has maximal improbability.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So simply by understanding that definition, we know a priori
Yeah.
that we couldn't have sufficient grounds to believe
Right.
that such an event was happening now.
Right.
Great.
But it remains a possible event.
It remains a possible event.
Yes.
So we have a priori knowledge
Yeah.
of the truth of this contingent proposition.
Right.
Or, well, more precisely, of the falsity of its negation.
Yeah, right. Okay, yeah.
But yeah.
So that certainly challenges our intuitive notions about
Yeah.
the limits of a priori knowledge.
I think it does.
Yeah.
Gareth Evans offers another one.
Okay.
He says, if actually P, then P.
Okay.
So consider an instance of that form.
Okay.
If any post is actually read, then it is read.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Now that's contingent
Mm-hmm.
because the post might be read in the actual world,
Yeah.
but not read in some other possible world.
Right.
But we can know a priori that if it is actually read, then it is read.
Right.
Because that holds true
Yeah.
in the context of the actual world.
Yeah.
So it's contingent in general scope,
Mm-hmm.
but arguably a priori knowable
Yeah.
in its application to the actual.
Right. Okay.
And then, of course,
And
there's
then there's the old chestnut.
yeah, the classic, I am here now.
I am here now, exactly.
Yeah.
So that proposition is also contingent. I mean, you don't necessarily have to be in this place at this time.
Right.
However, whenever and wherever you utter it.
You can know a priori that it's true.
Yeah.
In that context.
Yeah.
Independent of, any kind of specific empirical investigation at that moment.
Right. Okay, so we've seen that the scope of a priori knowledge extends beyond the realm of the strictly necessary.
Yeah.
But the encyclopedia then goes on to talk about
Mm-hmm.
this distinction between analytic and synthetic.
Right.
So within these a priori propositions, for the philosopher reflecting on the nature of truth, how should we understand this difference between analytic and synthetic?
Yeah, so analytic a priori propositions, these are the ones whose truth is grounded solely in the meaning of the terms involved. So we can go back to all bachelors are unmarried males.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
If you fully grasp the definitions of bachelor and unmarried male, the truth of that proposition is self-evident.
Yeah.
And it's often characterized as being true in virtue of meaning.
Yeah.
Okay, now synthetic a priori propositions, on the other hand, are those that are not analytic. So their truth isn't simply a consequence of the definitions involved.
Yeah.
Yet they are claimed to be knowable a priori.
Right.
So the encyclopedia gives examples like no object can be red and green all over at the same time.
Right.
Or certain foundational moral principles.
Right.
Like it's wrong to punish the innocent. Now, these don't appear to be true simply because of, the definitions of red, green, object, punish, innocent.
Right.
Yet many philosophical traditions, I think, would argue that we have this kind of a priori access to their truth.
Okay, so that distinction between analytic and synthetic within the a priori is clearly crucial for evaluating different epistemological theories.
Absolutely.
So let's move on to this question of fallibility and defeasibility. Can our a priori justifications ever lead us to false beliefs?
Or can they be overridden by further evidence?
Yeah, absolutely. Just as, our senses can sometimes deceive us and lead to, empirically justified false beliefs. It seems that our a priori justifications aren't immune to this kind of error.
Okay.
And the encyclopedia gives, Immanuel Kant's conviction that every event has a cause as a potential example here.
Yeah.
Kant took this to be a principle knowable a priori, yet contemporary physics with, exploration of quantum phenomena and so forth suggests that there may be genuinely uncaused events. Right.
Yeah.
So if that's right, then Kant's principle is false.
Right.
So he would have been a priori justified in believing something that turned out to be incorrect.
Yeah.
So that's the essence of fallibility in the a priori realm.
Okay. And what about defeasibility? So can subsequent evidence, whether it's a priori or a posteriori, undermine our a priori justification?
Yeah, absolutely. So consider, these seemingly self-evident a priori claims.
Okay.
Like, happiness is always intrinsically good, or, it's always wrong to punish the innocent.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Further philosophical reflection,
Yeah.
exploring thought experiments,
Right.
cases where, happiness is derived from malicious acts, or
Right.
maybe, the necessity of punishing one innocent person to prevent
Right.
some kind of, widespread catastrophe.
Yeah.
These kinds of considerations can really challenge
Yeah.
these
Yeah.
initial intuitions and potentially defeat
Yeah.
our original a priori justification.
Right, right. So it's not that the a priori is giving us
Right.
sort of incorrigible
No,
justification.
not at all. And
John.
John Hawthorne gives a really nice example, I think, of this.
Okay.
He imagines, a mathematician.
Who's meticulously developing a proof.
Right.
This seems like a purely a priori endeavor.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And then he receives compelling empirical evidence
Yeah.
that suggests, either that he's suffering from some delusion,
Right.
or that, his mathematical abilities have been
Right.
compromised somehow.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Now that would, I think, pretty clearly undermine
Yeah.
his justification,
Yeah.
even if it was originally a priori.
Yeah. So even the seemingly secure domain of mathematics
Yeah.
isn't immune to revision
Right.
based on other forms of evidence.
That's right. And the classic Sorites paradox, I think, about heaps,
Right.
further exemplifies this fallibility
Yeah.
of a priori justification.
Yeah.
So, we might feel a priori justified in believing that removing a single grain from a heap
Right.
still leaves us with a heap.
Right. Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And that a collection of, 1,000 grains is a heap.
Right.
But these seemingly, justified a priori beliefs,
Yeah. Yeah.
when we combine them through, a series of steps,
Yeah.
lead to the absurd conclusion that,
Yeah.
even 1 or 0 grains could be a heap.
Right.
Right. So clearly something's gone wrong.
Right.
And at least one of our initial a priori justifications
Mhm.
must be false.
Right. And this, I think, challenges Kant's, famous notion that a priori knowledge is absolutely independent of all experience.
Yeah. And the encyclopedia, I think, rightly points out that,
Mhm.
Demanding absolute independence
Yeah.
from all experience might be too stringent a criterion.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
A more nuanced understanding is that a priori knowledge and justification are independent of experience,
Mm-hmm.
beyond that which is necessary to grasp the concepts.
Okay.
So, for example, experiential engagement is likely required
Yeah.
to acquire the concept of bachelor.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
But once you have that concept,
Right.
our justification for believing that all bachelors are unmarried males
Right.
doesn't require further empirical investigation.
Right. 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 Right.
Now, this doesn't imply that
Right.
a priori justification can't be defeated by empirical evidence.
Right.
But I think it does weaken the argument
Yeah.
that its independence from experience somehow guarantees that it can't be.
Right. Right. The encyclopedia also touches on Kitcher and Putnam's views on this.
Yes. So Philip Kitcher has argued
Mm-hmm.
that if genuine, all things considered a priori justification existed,
Yeah.
then we would be entitled to just disregard
Yeah.
any empirical information about the actual world.
Okay.
Right. And Hilary Putnam goes even further.
Mm-hmm.
He suggests that a priori justification leads to truths,
Mm-hmm.
that it would always be rational to believe,
Mm-hmm.
regardless of empirical considerations.
Right.
But I think in light of the examples that we've been discussing,
Right.
the possibility of a priori justified false beliefs
Yeah.
and the various ways in which a priori justification can be challenged or overridden,
Mm-hmm.
I think these more extreme positions
Yeah.
are very difficult to maintain.
Yeah.
So I think the point here is that justification,
Yeah.
whether it's a priori or a posteriori,
Yeah.
is inherently tied to
Yeah.
the evidence that's available or that we have reason to think should be available.
Yeah.
Right? And
Yeah.
further evidence can always potentially alter its status.
So it's not infallible. Let's just say that.
No.
Okay, so let's delve now into the nature of a priori justification itself.
Okay.
What
Yeah.
fundamentally constitutes it?
Yeah. So the standard initial response is that it's independence from experience,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Beyond the foundational experience needed for concept acquisition.
Yeah.
However,
Mm-hmm.
the encyclopedia raises a really crucial point here. It's the scope and definition of experience itself
Okay.
All right.
Yeah.
So if we define experience very narrowly
Yeah.
as, just sense experience of the external world,
Right.
then various other forms of cognitive access,
Yeah.
such as, introspection, our sense of our bodily position, proprioception, memory,
Yeah.
even testimonial evidence,
Okay.
might be categorized as a priori
Yeah.
if you have that very narrow view of experience.
Right. Right. And that categorization feels sort of counterintuitive to me,
It does, yeah.
given how we normally.
I think a more comprehensive understanding of experience
Yeah.
in this context would include, not just sense perception of the external world,
Yeah.
but also introspection, proprioception, memory, and testimony.
Okay.
I think the underlying aim here
Yeah.
is to distinguish between, primary sources of justification
Yeah.
and those that primarily serve to transmit justification, regardless of its original source.
Right,
So,
right.
sense perception and introspection
Mm-hmm.
give us direct information
Yeah.
about, the world and our inner states.
Right.
Proprioception gives us information about our bodies.
Okay.
But memory and testimony largely transmit justifications
Yeah.
that were originally either a priori or empirical in nature.
Okay, so that's a broader definition that maybe provides a more useful framework for analyzing the sources of our beliefs.
That's right.
But even with this clarified understanding,
Yeah.
it doesn't fully elucidate how a priori justification operates.
That's right. What's the underlying mechanism?
What's the basis? Yeah.
Yeah.
So a very prominent perspective in philosophy is that a priori justification
Yeah.
rests upon these rational intuitions or insights,
Mm-hmm.
whereas empirical justification is grounded in experience
Yes.
in the way we just discussed. But before we go further into the nature of these rational intuitions, I think it's helpful to distinguish between the intuitions themselves, these sort of immediate intellectual seemings, and the intuitive judgments that we formulate based upon them.
Right.
And this is especially relevant in the context of philosophical thought experiments.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So these carefully constructed scenarios philosophers use to probe our conceptual understanding.
Right.
So what exactly is the content of these intuitive judgments that arise from engaging with these kinds of thought experiments?
Yeah. So Anna Sarah Malmgren proposes that intuitions are specific types of mental states that have the capacity to justify the intuitive judgment that we make when we contemplate philosophical thought experiments. So now characterizing the content of those judgments proves to be pretty complex because different philosophical viewpoints diverge on this. Malmgren herself adopts a view where she defines them by reference to paradigm cases. So she says, an intuitive judgment is the kind of judgment that's evoked by these paradigm examples. So she cites judgments arising from the